Hello, everybody. We mentioned before the Daubert test and concerning the admissibility of evidence if we actually have to go into a courtroom setting. And I wanted to take just a couple minutes and cover that a little bit more in depth, if you would. So before Daubert, there was a case that most of our federal courts relied upon, and the Supreme Court as well. It was called the Fry Standard, the Fry case. And so Mr. Fry was convicted of second-degree murder. He tried to exonerate himself by taking, at the time, a very simplistic lie detector, sort of a precursor to a polygraph, where they asked him questions and checked his blood pressure. And so he tried to use that to exonerate himself. And the courts ruled that that was not scientifically valid to be presented for evidence in terms of an appeal. And that was the DC Circuit. So that was 1923. That's a long time ago. That's 100 years ago now, almost. So they established what was known as the Fry Standard. And so in order to admit evidence, scientific evidence, into a court of law, said that the expert's opinion had to be based upon scientific technique, and only where the technique is generally accepted as relevant by the scientific community. And so for most of us, that would assume that it was some sort of peer-reviewed published paper. Then it could be used as evidence in a court setting. If it wasn't, then no dice. You were not going to you were not going to add that or introduce that as evidence into a court, either prosecution or defense on either side of that. So again, that was 100 years ago. We talked about digital forensics really kind of getting it started in the 90s. And there was a new court case that went to the Supreme Court. And we mentioned also, right, understanding court precedent or case precedent. And this is how we establish our laws. So Jason Daubert and Eric Schuler were both minor children that were born with very serious birth defects in the 90s. And so their parents and other groups sued Merrill or Dow Pharmaceuticals, Dow Chemical, in California, alleging that the birth defects had been caused by bendectine, which was a prescription anti-nausea drug that had been marketed by Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. So this is 1993. So this is 70 years after Fry is the next time that we're going to, when could you admit evidence? And so Daubert went away from that generally accepted, must be peer reviewed, and focused more on whether or not the reasoning or the methodology that was used was that scientifically valid, and was the reasoning properly applied to the facts at hand. And so it broadened the definition of what evidence could be admitted into a court. And so there's a few things we get from that, the Daubert standard, right? Is the theory or is the technique, has it been tested? Has it been peer reviewed or published? It's still important-ish, but it's not the end all be all. Is there a known or is there potential error rate, right? Could it fail? And you have to disclose that. Are there maintenance or controlling standards that are associated with this to control for or to identify errors? And then is there widespread acceptance in the relevant scientific community? So again, we're still talking about scientists here in that Daubert and in the Daubert standard. So that precedent was expanded by a couple of cases that came along a little bit later on. So General Electric versus Joyner kind of addressed the abuse of exclusion. So a district judge went, that's not valid. They're still kind of relying on the Fry standard, if you will, in 1997, and that was overturned and said, no, you have to look at the methodology and is the methodology relevant? And then it was expanded by Kumho Tire versus Carmichael in '99 to engineers, and then what applies to us, other professionals, so non-scientists. Can we, as forensics specialists, as people trained to find this evidence, can we testify, and can that be admissible into a court of law? And under the Daubert test, yes, it absolutely can. And so remember, our first goal is always to preserve the evidence, so be very careful about the tools that we're using, that those are verified tools. We want to use accepted methods and standardized methodology. And at some point, we may be required to offer expert testimony. And so that's really that interpretation of the facts that we found, the interpretation of the evidence. What does that actually mean? And we'll talk a lot about that as we go through this course. So just as a caveat, remember, evidence, right, is not just guilt. So evidence can be something, a fact that shows guilt, or a fact that shows innocence. And it's just as important for us to use a good methodology and verified tools, right, to find evidence of innocence as it is for us to find evidence of guilt. And so that hopefully explains a little bit better about the Daubert standard that we use for admissibility of our digital forensics evidence.